$100,000 floral arrangements suffocated the grand cathedral, masking the stench of a crumbling empire. A paralyzed crime lord sat abandoned at the altar, surrounded by grinning enemies. Then a heavy-set cleaning woman stepped onto the marble, extended a calloused hand, and asked the impossible "Shall we dance?" Orchids from Colombia draped every pillar of Oaxaca Castle's grand ballroom, their heavy, sweet perfume doing little to mask the thick tension rolling off the 500 guests. This was meant to be the wedding of the decade, an event covered by private society columns and monitored by the FBI from unmarked vans down the estate's sprawling driveway. Lorenzo Johnson, the ruthless head of the Johnson Syndicate, sat at the altar. His broad shoulders were encased in a flawless, custom-tailored Brioni tuxedo, his sharp jaw locked in a posture of absolute authority. Yet from the waist down, his legs lay motionless, strapped securely into a customized $20,000 Permobile F5 Corpus wheelchair. 6 months ago, a car bomb outside a discreet cafe in Palermo had shattered Lorenzo's spine. The blast had taken his mobility, but not his mind, and certainly not his iron grip on the eastern seaboard's underworld. Today was supposed to be his ultimate victory, a marriage to Victoria Astor, a union that would bridge the bloody violent history of his family with the sterile, old-money political influence of hers. It was a strategic alliance, forged in backroom deals at the exclusive Core Club in Manhattan. Minutes bled into hours. The string quartet, seated near the imported marble altar, had cycled through Pachelbel's canon, in D so many times the cellist's fingers were visibly trembling under the heavy stares of capos and underbosses. Lorenzo remained perfectly still, his dark eyes scanning the pews. In the third row sat the heads of the Lucchese and Genovese families, their initial expressions of polite respect slowly melting into barely concealed smirks. A crippled Don was already a target. A publicly humiliated crippled Don was a dead man walking. Richard Richie Moretti. Lorenzo's underboss finally approached the altar. Richie's heavy wingtip shoes clicked against the floor, a sound that seemed to echo like gunshots in the sudden, suffocating quiet of the room. Richie leaned down, his face pale, smelling faintly of cold sweat and expensive scotch. "Boss," Richie muttered, his voice barely carrying over the scraping of a cello bow. "We just got a ping from her security detail. She's gone. Victoria boarded a private jet at Teterboro 20 minutes ago. She took a flight to Geneva." Lorenzo's expression did not change. He did not blink. Alone. Richie swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing above his tight collar. "No, boss. She's with your cousin, Dominic. They cleared out the offshore accounts linked to the Astor merger before they took off." Humiliation was a luxury Lorenzo could not afford. The betrayal sliced deep, a serrated knife twisting into his gut, but he refused to bleed in front of the sharks circling in the pews. Dominic, his own blood, had not just stolen the bride and the money. He had orchestrated this spectacle to publicly castrate Lorenzo in front of the commission. "Very well," Lorenzo said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that betrayed none of the volcanic rage threatening to crack his ribs. "Announce that the bride has fallen ill. Clear the room. We reconvene at the safe house in Brooklyn." Lorenzo reached for the sleek, matte black joystick mounted on the armrest of his wheelchair. His thumb pressed the primary ignition, intending to pivot the heavy machine and roll down the aisle with whatever dignity a paralyzed man could muster. The joystick flashed a violent flashing red. Lorenzo frowned, pressing the manual override sequence. Nothing happened. The heavy reinforced motors beneath his seat were completely dead. He pushed the backup battery switch. Dead. A chilling realization washed over him, colder than the Palermo winter. His Mechanica man Dominic had personally vetted had serviced the chair this morning. Dominic hadn't just stolen the bride. He had severed the power coupling. He had intentionally marooned Lorenzo at the altar, turning his state-of-the-art mobility device into a heavy, useless anchor. "Richie." Lorenzo whispered, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the armrests. "The chair is dead. I can't move." Richie's eyes widened in sheer panic. To physically carry the Don out of the room like a helpless child would destroy the last remaining shred of his authority. The Lucchese family would order a hit before midnight. The room was already murmuring, the whispers growing louder, sharper. Guests were shifting in their seats. The illusion of power was shattering piece by piece under the vaulted ceilings of Oheka Castle. Lorenzo was trapped a king, locked in a gilded cage of his own broken body, waiting for the wolves to strike. Panic is a quiet, creeping thing before it screams. Bianca Miller stood near the grand, heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom, clutching a silver polishing cloth in her damp hands. At 28 years old, Bianca was an employee of elite event staffing, earning $22 an hour to be entirely invisible. She was a woman of undeniable size, unapologetically fat, with thick, powerful thighs that chafed beneath her cheap polyester skirt, wide hips, and a soft, heavy belly that strained against the apron strings tied around her waist. Her face was round, flushed with the heat of the room, and the physical exertion of hauling catering trays all morning. Society told Bianca to shrink, to hide, to apologize for the space she occupied. But right now, standing in the shadows of billionaires and killers, she was the only one seeing the room clearly. She had spent her life observing people who looked past her. Because of her weight, people assumed she was slow or invisible or insignificant. They spoke freely around her. They dropped their guard. Earlier, while arranging napkins near the coat check, she had seen Dominic Johnson slip a small metallic object to a man with a scarred neck. She had noticed the sharp, distinct scent of battery acid lingering near the altar when she swept the marble steps. Now, looking down the long, agonizing stretch of the aisle, Bianca saw the paralyzed man sitting frozen in his high-tech chair. She saw the panicked, subtle tugging of his underboss. Most importantly, Bianca saw the man with the scarred neck in the third row, slowly unbuttoning his tuxedo jacket, his hand slipping toward his waistband. The Don wasn't just stuck. He was being lined up for execution. Bianca didn't think about the danger. She didn't think about her own safety or the fact that she was a fat, exhausted maid stepping into a war zone of Italian mobsters. She only saw a man who, despite his millions, was utterly defenseless, stripped of his dignity and his mobility. She knew the biting sting of humiliation entirely too well. Wiping her sweaty palms on her apron, Bianca stepped out of the shadows. Her heavy black work shoes squeaked slightly against the polished marble. The sound was microscopic, yet as she moved down the center aisle, the murmurs in the room began to die down. The wealthy elites, the hardened criminals, the high society socialites, they all turned to stare at the large woman in the ill-fitting uniform marching purposefully towards the altar. Richie reached for his concealed weapon, his eyes darting to Bianca. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing? Get back to the kitchens." Bianca ignored him. She carried her weight with a sudden grounding authority, her wide frame imposing as she stepped directly in front of the altar, placing herself between Lorenzo and the third row. She looked down at the Mafia boss. Up close, Lorenzo's eyes were a terrifying, fathomless black, swimming with a lethal mixture of pride and fury. She offered a small, polite smile, her round cheeks dimpling. She extended a thick, calloused hand toward him. "Shall we dance, Mr. Johnson?" Bianca asked, her voice clear and surprisingly steady, cutting through the silence of the massive cathedral room. Lorenzo stared at her, genuinely violently thrown off balance. "Excuse me," he rasped. "Your chair," Bianca said, her voice dropping to a low whisper meant only for him and Richie. "I saw the manual release levers by the rear axle when I swept earlier. It's heavy, but I've got the weight to push it. Let me move you." Before Lorenzo could object, Bianca stepped behind the massive custom wheelchair. She was heavy, and right now that weight was her greatest asset. She leaned her soft, substantial body against the back of the heavy metallic frame, reached down, and threw the manual override latches with a loud metallic clack. The lock disengaged. "Play something faster," Bianca barked over her shoulder at the terrified string quartet. Shocked into obedience, the cellist immediately tore into a fast, aggressive Vivaldi piece. With a deep breath, planting her thick legs firmly on the marble, Bianca pushed. The 300-pound chair plus Lorenzo's weight glided forward. But Bianca didn't just push him toward the exit like an invalid. She understood the assignment. She understood pride. Using her wide stance and core strength, she pushed the chair in a sweeping, elegant arc across the front of the altar. She swung him around the heavy rubber tires, gripping the marble, creating a beautiful spinning dance. Lorenzo instantly caught on to the charade. He straightened his spine, lifting his chin, masking his vulnerability with a cold, terrifying smile aimed directly at the Lucchese family. To the room, it didn't look like a rescue. It looked like a calculated, arrogant display of dominance. A don dancing with a servant while his bride fled. As she spun the chair, pulling him closer to the side exit, Bianca leaned down her chest, brushing the back of his tuxedo. "Mr. Johnson," she whispered urgently into his ear, the Vivaldi masking her words. "There is a puddle of battery acid under where you were just parked. And the man in the third row, the one with the scar, he has a suppressed weapon." Lorenzo's eyes widened infinitesimally. He shifted his gaze exactly as Bianca planted her heavy work boots and violently jerked the wheelchair to the left. Puffed! Puffed! 2 suppressed rounds shattered the stained glass exactly where Lorenzo's head had been a fraction of a second before. The marble altar chipped, spraying white dust into the air. The illusion of the dance shattered. The ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. Women screamed, men drew firearms, and the heavy mahogany pews were overturned as the 5 families scrambled for cover. "Hold on!" Bianca yelled over the deafening roar of gunfire. Using all of her mass, she threw her entire body weight behind the heavy chair, driving her legs like pistons. She rammed Lorenzo's wheelchair through the heavy side doors of the sacristy, bursting into the narrow, dimly lit hallway, just as a hail of bullets chewed through the heavy oak behind them. They were alive. But the war for the Johnson Empire had just begun, and the Don's life was now in the heavily calloused, unexpectedly capable hands of a caterwaiter from Huntington. Gunpowder and pulverized marble choked the air of the narrow sacristy. Inside the dimly lit room, the deafening roar of automatic weapons from the ballroom was muffled only slightly by the thick, reinforced oak doors. Bianca did not stop moving. Her chest heaved, her breath coming in ragged, adrenaline-fueled gasps, but her grip on the heavy, rubberized handles of the Permobile F5 wheelchair remained absolute. "Service elevator." Bianca barked, her voice stripped of any subservient customer service polish. "Elite event staffing strictly forbids us from using the main halls. I know the blueprints of this castle better than the security team." Lorenzo Johnson sat rigidly in his chair, brushing a thick layer of white plaster dust from the lapels of his Brioni tuxedo. His dark eyes flicked up to the woman looming behind him. She was sweating profusely, her flushed, round face set in a mask of pure, unadulterated concentration. She was magnificently sturdy, her broad shoulders and thick arms radiating a raw, undeniable physical power that had just saved his life. "Lead the way, Bianca," Lorenzo commanded, his baritone voice a low rumble. Richie burst through the sacristy doors a second later, his Glock 19 drawn, his face smeared with someone else's blood. "Boss, the Lucchese crew is sweeping the perimeter." Dominic paid off the outer guard detail. "We are completely boxed in." "Not completely," Bianca interjected, shoving her substantial weight against the heavy chair and pivoting it toward a narrow archway hidden behind a tapestry. "The loading docks. The catering vans are parked out back near the secondary kitchen. The keys are always left in the ignitions for rapid unloading." Richie looked at her, his eyes wild with panic. "A catering van. Are you insane? We need armored transport." Lorenzo raised a single commanding hand. The gesture instantly silenced his underboss. "An armored Cadillac Escalade is exactly what Dominic's shooters are looking for. A Ford Transit van smelling of stale salmon is invisible. We follow her." Bianca leaned into the chair and pushed. Navigating the labyrinthine service corridors of Oheka Castle required massive physical exertion, but Bianca's size, the very thing society constantly urged her to minimize, was her greatest weapon. When the wheels of the heavy chair caught on a thick threshold, she didn't call for Richie's help. She planted her heavy, thick-soled work shoes onto the concrete floor, engaged her powerful thighs, and forced the 300-pound machine over the obstacle with a loud grunt. Descending in the freight elevator, the trio stood in suffocating silence. Lorenzo watched Bianca discreetly. She was breathing heavily, her hands resting on her wide hips, her cheap uniform stained with sweat and dirt. Most civilians would be weeping, paralyzed by the sudden eruption of mob violence. Bianca simply looked pissed off. "You handled yourself remarkably well back there." Lorenzo noted his calculating gaze measuring her. Bianca wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead. "Growing up as the fattest girl in a tough neighborhood in Queens teaches you a few things, Mr. Johnson. Mostly it teaches you that shrinking in the corner just makes you an easier target. You have to take up your space." Lorenzo felt a strange, unfamiliar spark of profound respect ignite in his chest. Society looked at his paralyzed legs and saw a broken king. Society looked at her large body and saw an invisible servant. They were both entirely underestimated. Ding. The elevator doors scraped open, revealing the cavernous, fluorescent-lit loading dock. 3 white catering vans sat idling, their rear doors thrown open. The kitchen staff had long since fled the gunfire, leaving a chaotic mess of half-empty chafing dishes and discarded aprons. Richie sprinted ahead, sweeping the dock with his firearm. "Clear! Get him on the hydraulic lift," Bianca instructed, jogging toward the nearest van. She slapped the large red button on the back of the truck, lowering the metal ramp. Richie pushed Lorenzo onto the platform, and Bianca hoisted them up into the dark, cramped cargo hold. The air inside smelled sharply of garlic sterno fuel and damp cardboard. "I'll drive," Bianca stated, climbing directly into the driver's seat. Her wide frame filled the space comfortably. She threw the heavy van into gear. "Where to?" "Red Hook," Lorenzo answered from the back, his voice steady despite the indignity of being wedged between stacks of dirty catering plates. "Pier 41. I own a decommissioned meatpacking warehouse there. It operates under a blind shell company. Dominic doesn't know it exists." Tires squealed as Bianca slammed her heavy boot onto the accelerator. The van lurched forward, breaking through the rear service gates of the estate, just as 2 black SUVs filled with armed men tore around the front driveway. Bianca merged seamlessly onto the Jericho Turnpike, blending in perfectly with the afternoon commercial traffic. The billionaire mob boss and his loyal underboss were effectively smuggled out of a war zone inside a rolling kitchen. Rain began to lash against the windshield, as the van rumbled over the cobblestone streets of Brooklyn. Pier 41 was a desolate stretch of decaying industrial architecture, shadowed by the towering rusted cranes of the waterfront. Bianca navigated the van into an alleyway, pulling right up to the rusted corrugated metal doors of Lorenzo's warehouse. Richie hopped out manually, hauling the heavy doors open on their rusted tracks. Bianca drove the van inside, cutting the engine. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the drumming of the rain on the tin roof. Inside the warehouse was a stark contrast to its dilapidated exterior. The space had been converted into a state-of-the-art tactical safe house. Racks of encrypted servers hummed in the corner. A fully stocked medical bay sat behind glass partitions, and a massive mahogany desk dominated the center of the room. It was the nerve center of a ghost. Bianca lowered the hydraulic lift, allowing Richie to pull Lorenzo out. The moment Lorenzo's wheels hit the concrete floor, the Don's demeanor shifted. The vulnerability of the escape was gone. He was back in his element. "Richie!" Lorenzo snapped, rolling himself forward, using the rims of his wheels since the battery was still dead. "Get on the secure line. I want an immediate lockdown on all operations. The Lucchese family thinks I'm dead, and Dominic thinks he has my throne. Let them celebrate. I want them comfortable." Boss Dominic and Victoria took the offshore accounts, Richie reminded him, grimly pacing the floor. Victoria had the digital authorization keys. They transferred nearly $400 million to Pictet and CIS in Geneva. Without that capital, the capos won't follow us. Money is blood. Lorenzo's jaw clenched. Victoria is vain, but she is not a financial genius. Dominic is using her. And I am going to bleed them dry. Bianca stood quietly by the van, unbuttoning her tight, uncomfortable catering apron. She tossed it onto a nearby crate, standing in her simple black t-shirt and skirt. "Excuse me, Mr. Johnson." Both men turned to look at her. "The battery on your chair," Bianca pointed out, walking slowly toward him. "When I was pushing you out, I noticed the smell of the acid wasn't coming from the main power cells. It was coming from the backup junction. I've fixed enough heavy-duty floor buffers to know that if the main lines are just severed, not fried, they can be spliced." Lorenzo looked at her, his dark eyes narrowing with intense curiosity. "You can fix my chair. I have a roll of electrical tape in my pocket, and there's a tool bench over there," Bianca said, her thick arms crossing over her chest. "Give me 10 minutes." Lorenzo nodded slowly. As Bianca knelt heavily beside his chair, her soft, thick thighs resting on the cold concrete, Lorenzo watched her hands. They were large, capable, and remarkably gentle as she stripped the wires Dominic's mechanic had cut, twisting the copper back together. She didn't treat him like a piece of broken glass. She treated him like a man whose vehicle simply needed a jump start. "You have a very specific set of observational skills." "Bianca," Lorenzo said softly, the rumble of his voice vibrating in the quiet room. "When people look right through you, you get to see exactly what they're hiding," Bianca replied, without looking up, her nimble fingers working the tape. "Earlier today, I heard your cousin Dominic talking to Miss Astor on a burner phone. He told her not to book a suite at the Ritz-Carlton. He said the Four Seasons des Bergs was safer because it had an underground private funicular for VIPs. Richie stopped, pacing, his eyes widening. "Boss, if we know where they are staying, we know where they are logging in from." Lorenzo finished a cruel, brilliant smile touching his lips. Click. Bianca stood up, wiping grease on her skirt. "Try it now." Lorenzo pressed the ignition on his armrest. The joystick lit up with a brilliant, solid green light. The heavy motors hummed to life. He pushed the stick forward, and the 300-pound machine glided effortlessly across the floor. He spun the chair around, facing Bianca directly. "You have given me my legs back," Lorenzo said, his tone utterly devoid of his usual guarded cynicism. "And you have given me my enemies. Tell me, Bianca Miller, what is a woman of your caliber doing serving lukewarm appetizers to criminals?" Bianca met his intense gaze, refusing to look away. "Surviving, just like you." 48 hours later, the narrative in the underworld had completely shifted. Rumors of Lorenzo Johnson's assassination were printed in ciphered messages across the dark web. Dominic had confidently returned from Geneva, setting up his temporary command center in the 5YP suite of the Core Club in Manhattan. Victoria Astor, however, had remained in Switzerland, tasked with managing the newly acquired funds at the Four Seasons des Bergs. Inside the Red Hook warehouse, Lorenzo sat at the mahogany desk, surrounded by glowing monitors. Bianca stood beside him, holding a steaming mug of black coffee. Over the past 2 days, she hadn't left his side. She had become his sounding board, her sharp, pragmatic mind cutting through Richie's overly aggressive tactical suggestions. A deep, unspoken intimacy had rooted itself between the Paralyzed Mafia boss and the heavy-set maid. He valued her intellect. She valued his respect. "The IP address is locked," Lorenzo announced, his fingers flying across his customized wide-set keyboard. "She is accessing the Pictet and C portal, using the hotel's secure Wi-Fi routed through Dominic's VPN. "Can your hacker intercept the authorization tokens?" Bianca asked, leaning over him. Her proximity brought a warm scent of vanilla and laundry soap that Lorenzo found wildly intoxicating. "Better," Lorenzo smirked. "Victoria is using biometric authentication, but she doesn't realize that my accounts at Pictet possess a dormant dead man's switch. Because Dominic bypassed standard protocol to steal the funds, the money is currently sitting in a holding ledger. I am pinging the Swiss authorities with proof of corporate espionage and money laundering attached directly to Victoria Astor's name." Richie chuckled darkly from the corner. "The Swiss hate messy money." "Exactly," Lorenzo said, hitting the enter key with a definitive strike. "I just triggered a red notice. Interpol will be knocking on her luxury suite door in exactly 4 minutes. The accounts are frozen. The money is locked. Dominic is officially broke." Lorenzo spun his chair away from the desk, his eyes burning with lethal intent. "Richie, it's time." Richie racked the slide of his customized assault rifle. "I'll rally the loyalists. We hit the Core Club in 20 minutes. "No," Lorenzo corrected softly. "We don't hit the club. We invite Dominic to his own funeral." An hour later, Dominic Johnson sat in the lavishly appointed lounge of the Core Club, sipping a $2,000 glass of Macallan. He was flanked by 3 heavily armed Lucchese soldiers. He was the new king of New York. His burner phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Your bride is in a Swiss federal prison. Your accounts are frozen. Meet me where it started, or the 5 families will see the ledgers proving you stole from them to fund your coup." Dominic's face drained of color. He stood up abruptly, his glass shattering on the floor. "Oheka Castle," he whispered to his guards. "Get the cars, now." Midnight draped Oheka Castle in heavy, suffocating shadows. The police tape from the wedding massacre had been torn down, leaving the grand ballroom an empty, haunting cavern of bullet-riddled marble and dead orchids. Dominic kicked open the heavy oak doors, his weapon raised, his men fanning out behind him. The room was pitch black. "Lorenzo!" Dominic shouted, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You crippled bastard, show yourself!" A single brilliant spotlight snapped on, illuminating the shattered altar. Lorenzo Johnson sat in his wheelchair, perfectly still, his hands resting elegantly on his armrests. He looked like a dark god carved from obsidian. "You stole my bride, Dominic." Lorenzo's voice boomed through a hidden PA system, chilling the blood in Dominic's veins. "You stole my money. You tried to steal my life. But you forgot one critical rule of this business." From the shadows behind the altar, heavy footsteps echoed. Bianca stepped into the light. She was no longer wearing a maid's uniform. She was dressed in a sleek, custom-tailored black trench coat that draped beautifully over her wide, powerful frame. In her steady hands, she held a suppressed tactical shotgun. "You never overlook the invisible people," Bianca said, her voice a deadly calm wave that washed over the room. Dominic sneered, raising his pistol. "You brought a fat maid to kill me." Before Dominic could pull the trigger, the shadows lining the upper balconies of the ballroom shifted. Red laser sights painted Dominic's chest, his forehead and his throat. Richie and 50 loyal Johnson soldiers stepped out of the darkness, their weapons locked on the traitors. Lorenzo pressed his joystick, rolling slowly down the marble steps via a ramp Bianca had installed hours earlier. He stopped mere inches from his terrified cousin. "She isn't a maid, Dominic," Lorenzo said quietly, his eyes blacker than the night outside. "She is the woman who pushed me through hell when you left me to burn. She is my partner." Lorenzo didn't need to give the order. The click of 50 safeties disengaging was enough. Dominic dropped his weapon, falling to his knees as the realization of his total defeat crushed him. The Lucchese guards surrendered instantly, knowing they had been outplayed by a master. Lorenzo turned his chair, looking up at Bianca, the massive, beautiful woman who had unapologetically claimed her space in his violent world. She lowered her weapon, a soft, triumphant smile gracing her dimpled cheeks. "Shall we go home, mister?" Johnson, Bianca asked, extending her hand just as she had done 2 days prior. Lorenzo reached out his strong fingers, wrapping securely around hers. He pulled her close, the warmth of her heavy, comforting presence anchoring him entirely. "We shall miss Miller," Lorenzo murmured, kissing the back of her calloused hand. "We shall. If you want to see how Bianca and Lorenzo survive the night and take back the Johnson Empire, hit that like button, share this story with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for Part 3 and Part 4. Don't miss the explosive finale of this mafia romance.